Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this or felt underestimated in your own home, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your support tells me these stories matter and that none of us are truly alone in them. My husband, Daniel, used to say it with a sigh, the way someone talks about a weather condition they didn't ask for. She's not herself anymore, he'd tell friends, neighbors, even doctors. The loss really did something to her. He was talking about me, about the woman I became after my mother died, after a miscarriage that nearly took me with it, after months of sleepless nights where the house felt too big and too quiet. To anyone looking from the outside, his story made sense. I moved slower, I spoke less, I forgot small things, or at least I let him think I did. I cried at odd moments and stared out windows longer than necessary. People nodded when he spoke. They looked at me with pity. No one questioned him when he said I was broken. What Daniel never understood was that grief didn't erase my mind. It sharpened it. When you lose something precious, you start paying attention to what remains. You listen more closely. You notice patterns. And you learn very quickly who benefits from you being underestimated. I let him believe his version because it was safer. Safer to observe, safer to document, safer to wait. The first notebook wasn't intentional. It was a cheap spiral pad I grabbed from a kitchen drawer during one of those nights I couldn't sleep. Daniel was snoring beside me, his phone face down on the nightstand, like it always was now. I started writing because my thoughts wouldn't slow down. Dates, snippets of conversations, things he said that didn't line up with what he'd said the week before. At first, it was just a way to steady myself, to prove I wasn't imagining the shifts in our marriage. But over time, the notebook became something else, a witness. Daniel and I had been married for 15 years. We met young, built a life the slow, ordinary way. 2 cars, a modest house, Sunday dinners with his parents, vacations we saved for all year. We weren't dramatic people. We didn't scream or throw things. Our marriage didn't explode, it eroded. And erosion is harder to explain to outsiders. It looks like nothing until suddenly the ground gives way. After my miscarriage, something in him changed. He became managerial, like my grief was a project he'd taken on unwillingly. He spoke for me in public. He corrected me when I remembered things differently than he did. "You're confused," he'd say gently, smiling so others wouldn't notice the edge underneath. "You've been under a lot of stress." When bills went missing or money didn't add up, he'd sigh and say I must have misfiled them. When I asked about late nights at work, he'd remind me I was overly anxious now. I started writing those moments down, not because I knew I'd need them someday, but because something in my gut told me reality needed backup. He began controlling our finances slowly, the way you turn down a dimmer switch. At first, it was him helping because I was overwhelmed. Then it became him insisting. Then it became him telling me I didn't need access to certain accounts because it would only stress me out. I wrote dates, amounts, his exact words. I learned to keep my face neutral, to nod, to thank him for taking care of things. Inside, I was counting. People praise patience like it's passive. They don't understand the discipline it takes to stay quiet when you're being rewritten. Daniel liked to tell stories about me at gatherings, always with the same punchline. "She used to be so sharp," he'd laugh. "Now I have to remind her what day it is." Everyone chuckled sympathetically. I smiled. I poured drinks. I memorized who laughed the loudest. At home, he started leaving papers out, assuming I wouldn't read them or wouldn't understand. A loan document, a new credit card statement, emails printed and forgotten on the desk. Each time I waited until he slept. I photographed everything. I wrote notes about where I found it and when. The notebooks multiplied, hidden in places he never looked because he believed his own narrative too deeply to imagine me capable of strategy. That was his mistake, believing his performance. The night I realized there was another woman wasn't dramatic either. No lipstick on collars or whispered phone calls. It was an expense report, a hotel charge in a city he'd claimed he'd never visited, dinner for two, charged to a card I supposedly didn't know existed. I wrote it down. I didn't confront him. Confrontation gives liars time to adjust their stories. Silence lets them reveal themselves. Instead, I listened. I listened when he complained to his brother on the phone about how exhausting it was to be married to someone so fragile. I listened when he told a colleague he might need to put her somewhere if she didn't improve. I wrote those words exactly as he said them. I practiced keeping my breathing even while my hands shook. Fear is loud if you let it be. I learned to keep mine quiet. There were days I almost stopped, days when the loneliness pressed so hard against my chest I wondered if he was right, if I really was losing myself. On those days, I reread my own handwriting, the consistency of dates, the clarity of detail, the undeniable pattern. It grounded me. Gaslighting only works if you don't keep receipts. Daniel started planning something bigger. I could feel it in the way he watched me now, assessing, calculating. He asked questions about my memory, about whether I ever felt disoriented. He suggested doctors, therapists he chose. I agreed to everything because compliance made him careless, and carelessness creates evidence. I didn't know how or when I would use what I was collecting. I just knew I needed to survive long enough to finish the record. Revenge, when it came, wouldn't be loud or violent. It would be precise, and precision takes time. By the end of that year, my notebooks filled an entire shoebox: dates, lies, financial moves, emotional cruelty disguised as concern. A timeline of how a man dismantles a woman by convincing everyone she's already fallen apart. I would sometimes hold the box and feel its weight, tangible proof that I wasn't imagining any of it, that I wasn't broken. I was paying attention. Daniel kissed my forehead one night and told me softly that everything would be taken care of soon. I smiled back, the same gentle smile he mistook for confusion. Inside, I added another line to the page, another promise he didn't realize he'd made to me. Daniel's idea of being taken care of began revealing itself in small rehearsals. He'd ask me hypothetical questions over dinner, his tone casual, his eyes watching my reaction instead of his plate. What would I do if something happened to him? Did I ever feel overwhelmed managing daily tasks? Wouldn't it be easier if everything was simplified? I answered the way he expected me to answer, hesitantly, uncertainly, like someone afraid of getting it wrong. Then I excused myself and wrote everything down, including the way his fingers tapped the table when I hesitated, like he was waiting for a cue. He started attending my therapy sessions with me, insisting the therapist needed his input. He spoke over me there too, framing my silences as symptoms instead of choices. "She shuts down," he said once, shaking his head sadly. "She forgets whole conversations." I sat very still, letting him perform. The therapist glanced at me a few times, curious, but Daniel filled every pause with concern. When we got home, he praised me for doing well, for being cooperative. I added another note. He needed witnesses. It became clear he was building a case, not just against my competence, but against my autonomy. I found drafts of emails he'd written to his sister, unsent but saved, explaining how worried he was about my mental state. He'd underlined phrases like decline and safety concerns. I photographed those drafts too. Every sentence he wrote about me told me more about what he planned to do. People think manipulation is chaotic. It's not. It's methodical. At the same time, the financial pieces accelerated. Our joint account dwindled faster than it should have. Money moved between accounts I didn't recognize. When I asked gently, as if apologizing for my own curiosity, he reassured me with practiced patience. "I told you I'd handle it. You don't need to burden yourself." He began giving me cash instead of letting me use cards, framing it as kindness. Independence reduced to an allowance. I started backing up my notes digitally, emailing copies to an account he didn't know existed, one I'd set up years earlier for online shopping. I hid flash drives in places that would look absurd to anyone else, inside old cookbooks, taped beneath drawers. It felt paranoid sometimes, but paranoia implies fear without reason. I had reason. Daniel was planning to erase me, quietly, politely, with paperwork and pity. The other woman surfaced more clearly, too. Her name appeared on a calendar entry I wasn't supposed to see, half erased. I searched it online late at night, heart steady, fingers cold. She was younger, recently divorced, worked in a field adjacent to his. I didn't hate her. I barely felt anything at all. Infidelity felt almost predictable at that point, like one more tile falling in a pattern I'd already mapped. What frightened me more was how easily he spoke about my future without me. One evening, after a particularly long day, he mentioned looking into care options if I didn't improve. His voice was soft, reasonable. He said it like someone suggesting a vacation. "Just temporary," he added, watching my face, "so you can rest." I nodded and went upstairs and wrote for nearly an hour, documenting every word, every pause. I realized then that waiting too long could cost me more than a marriage. It could cost me my freedom. I began quietly reconnecting with people Daniel had slowly edged out of my life. An old friend for coffee, a cousin he'd always said was too dramatic. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't need to. I just needed anchors, people who remembered me before his story replaced mine. Each meeting reminded me how intact I still was. The breaking point came the day I found legal documents on his desk, a preliminary consultation summary, questions about power of attorney, medical decision-making. He hadn't signed anything yet. He was still gathering information, still deciding. I took photos with hands so steady they surprised me. That night, he slept easily beside me, convinced he was ahead of the game. I lay awake counting breaths, knowing the moment to act was approaching. I contacted a lawyer quietly, using my friend's phone. I didn't dramatize. I presented facts, timelines, evidence. When I placed my notebooks on her desk weeks later, her expression shifted from polite concern to something sharper. "You've been very thorough," she said. I told her I had to be. My safety depended on it. We planned carefully, not a confrontation, but a reveal. Truth is more powerful when it's documented. Daniel believed his charm would protect him. He believed my silence was weakness. He believed wrong. I waited until he invited his family over, until witnesses filled the room. I waited until he made another joke about my memory. Then I stood up calmly and said I needed to clarify something. The room stilled. I spoke slowly. I corrected one small detail in his story, then another. Then I said I kept notes. His smile faltered just slightly, enough for me to notice. I didn't accuse. I read. Dates, amounts, quotes. I watched realization dawn on faces around me. I watched Daniel's confidence unravel, not in panic, but in disbelief. He kept glancing at me like he was seeing a stranger, finally understanding I'd been watching him watch me all along. When I finished, I didn't shout or cry. I simply said I was done, that I had representation, that my documents were backed up, that any further attempts to control or discredit me would be addressed formally. Silence followed, heavy and irreversible. Later, alone, I felt the delayed tremor of it all. My hands shook then. That was when fear finally arrived, once it was safe. I let it pass. I packed essentials. I left with dignity intact. Daniel thought I was broken. What he didn't understand was that broken things can still cut, and careful records can outlast lies. The days after I left felt unreal, like I was walking through a version of my life someone else had imagined for me. I stayed with my cousin at first, the one Daniel always said was too emotional, too impulsive, too much. She didn't ask many questions. She just handed me a towel, cleared space in a drawer, and said, "You're safe here." That sentence did more for my nervous system than any therapy session ever had. Safety, I learned, isn't a concept. It's a feeling in the body when you can finally unclench. Daniel tried to reach me the very next morning. Missed calls, text messages that swung wildly in tone, confused concern, hurt disbelief, then irritation, then a thinly veiled warning about how I was overreacting and embarrassing us. I didn't respond. I forwarded everything to my lawyer and added timestamps to my records. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Documentation had become instinct. Word traveled fast through his family. Some of them called to check on me, voices careful, unsure which version of reality they were allowed to acknowledge. Others stayed silent. I didn't chase anyone for validation. The truth had already done its work. People don't like admitting they were fooled, especially when it was convenient to be fooled. I understood that. I wrote it down anyway, noting who reached out and who didn't. Patterns aren't just for villains. They explain communities, too. The other woman contacted me unexpectedly. A long message, hesitant, apologetic. She said she hadn't known the full extent of things, that Daniel had painted me as unstable, unpredictable, a risk to myself. She said she ended it the moment she realized the story didn't add up. I believed her, or maybe I just didn't need to disbelieve her. Anger would have required energy I was finally using to rebuild. I archived the message and noted the date. Closure doesn't always need confrontation. The legal process moved slowly, but it moved. Daniel's confidence dissolved as facts replaced narratives. Financial disclosures forced honesty he'd avoided for years. His lawyer stopped smirking. Mine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Paperwork speaks fluently. When Daniel tried to reframe my documentation as obsession, my therapist, one I chose myself this time, provided an evaluation that contradicted his claims entirely. Calm, oriented, consistent. The same word appeared again and again. Consistent. It felt like a quiet victory. There were moments I grieved the version of myself that might have been spared all of this if I'd spoken sooner. I wondered if silence had cost me time I'd never get back. But then I'd remember how carefully he'd laid his groundwork, how easily early objections would have been dismissed as instability. Survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's strategic. I forgave myself for choosing the path that kept me alive and free. Living without Daniel felt strange at first. Not lonely exactly, just unfamiliar. I made choices without narrating them to anyone. I ate when I was hungry. I slept without bracing for criticism. I noticed how my memory sharpened further once it was no longer under constant attack. Funny how clarity returns when no one is invested in your confusion. Months later, when the settlement finalized, I sat alone in my small rented apartment and opened the shoebox one last time. I reread entries from the earliest days, my handwriting shaky, uncertain. I felt tenderness for that version of me. She didn't know how strong she was yet. She just knew something was wrong and refused to let it disappear without a trace. I didn't destroy the notebooks. I didn't need to. I boxed them neatly and stored them away, not as trophies, not as weapons, but as proof. Proof that reality can be preserved even when someone is actively trying to erase it. Proof that being underestimated can be an advantage if you know how to use the space it gives you. People sometimes ask me now how I stayed so calm through it all. I tell them the truth. I wasn't calm. I was focused. Focus can look like detachment from the outside. It can look like weakness to someone who only respects noise. Daniel mistook my quiet for collapse because he'd never learned to listen for strength unless it announced itself. I still believe in love. I believe in partnership. but I also believe in self-trust in a way I didn't before. If something feels off, I don't dismiss it just because someone else speaks more confidently. I check the facts, I pay attention, I write things down if I have to. Memory is a muscle. Use it. After the settlement, people expected me to feel triumphant. They expected a clean emotional arc where relief arrived fully formed and stayed. What I felt instead was quiet, a deep, almost disorienting quiet, like stepping out of a room where a machine had been running for years and suddenly realizing how loud it had been all along. Without Daniel's voice narrating my supposed deficiencies, I had to relearn the sound of my own thoughts. That took longer than anyone warned me about. I began noticing how often I apologized out of habit. Sorry for taking up space. Sorry for needing clarification. Sorry for existing without explanation. Each apology felt like an echo of a version of myself that had learned survival through shrinking. I started correcting myself out loud when I could, not as punishment, but as practice. I don't need to apologize for that, I'd say gently, alone in my kitchen. Repetition rewires more than trauma ever does. Daniel tried once more to insert himself into my life months later under the guise of concern. An email arrived late at night, carefully worded, expressing hope that I was continuing to improve. He said he wanted closure. He said he worried about me being alone. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to my lawyer and wrote one last note in a fresh notebook I kept now, for myself, not for defense. Pattern repeated, boundary held, silence chosen. Closure doesn't come from the person who harmed you. It comes from the moment you stop waiting for them to understand. I slowly rebuilt routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks without a destination, cooking meals Daniel used to complain about, rearranging furniture simply because I felt like it. Each small act felt rebellious in a way that surprised me. Autonomy, I learned, can feel like defiance after long containment. I let myself enjoy that feeling without guilt. Friends began to comment on changes they couldn't quite name. "You seem clearer," said one. "Lighter," said another. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain the work behind that lightness, the hours of vigilance, the nights of fear, the discipline of restraint. Survivors don't owe anyone the full transcript of how they survived. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping women organize paperwork for legal aid and housing applications. I didn't tell my story unless asked. I just helped them sort documents, label folders, keep timelines. Watching their shoulders relax when chaos became order reminded me why I documented everything in the first place. Order creates breathing room. Breathing room creates options. Sometimes, late at night, doubt would still creep in. Old questions resurfaced. Should I have confronted him earlier? Should I have trusted someone sooner? On those nights, I reminded myself of the most important truth I'd learned. Clarity is a privilege not everyone has when they're inside the storm. You do the best you can with the information and safety you have at the time. Survival choices don't need retroactive perfection. I ran into Daniel once, unexpectedly, at a grocery store. He looked smaller somehow, less certain. He nodded like we were acquaintances. I nodded back. No anger surged, no fear either, just distance, the kind that can't be crossed because it isn't physical, it's earned. As I walked away, I realized something quietly monumental. He no longer knew me, and he never would again. I went home that day and opened my new notebook, the one without evidence or timelines or defensive margins. I wrote about the encounter, not because I needed proof, but because I wanted to mark the moment. Transformation deserves documentation, too. Looking back now, I understand why he thought I was broken. Broken things don't threaten systems built on control. Broken people are easy to narrate over. What he didn't anticipate was that I was using the space he left me to become precise, to become undeniable, to become free. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Being quiet doesn't mean you're powerless. Being observant doesn't mean you're passive. And being underestimated can be the greatest cover you'll ever have while you prepare to reclaim your life. I wasn't broken. I was documenting everything. And in doing so, I documented my way back to myself. Life didn't return to normal after that, because normal had been built on compromise I no longer intended to make. Instead, life became something quieter and more deliberate, like a house rebuilt with stronger foundations in places no one else could see. I learned how to sit with my own company without narrating it to anyone. I learned how to trust my instincts again, not as sudden flashes, but as steady signals I'd trained myself to hear. There were moments when anger finally surfaced, long after the danger had passed. It arrived unexpectedly during ordinary things, folding laundry, waiting in line, hearing a familiar phrase spoken by a stranger that echoed his voice. I let the anger exist without judgment. Suppressed emotion doesn't disappear, it relocates. Allowing it space was another form of documentation, just internal this time. I didn't act on it, I understood it. People sometimes misunderstand restraint. They assume that because I didn't scream or expose him publicly or seek revenge, that I must have forgiven him. Forgiveness for me was never the goal. Clarity was. Safety was. Peace was. I don't wish Daniel harm, but I also don't wish him access. Those are two very different things, and learning the difference changed my life. I began therapy again, not to prove anything, but to untangle the habits I'd developed under pressure. Hypervigilance is useful in crisis, but exhausting in peace. My therapist helped me identify which skills I could keep and which I could gently release. I didn't need to scan every room anymore. I didn't need to anticipate every shift in tone. I could rest. Rest felt radical at first. One afternoon, while sorting old boxes, I found an early notebook I hadn't looked at in months. I almost put it back without opening it. Then I sat on the floor and read the first few pages. I remembered the woman who wrote them, unsure, frightened, but determined enough to keep writing anyway. I felt pride rise in my chest, not loud or boastful, but solid. Survival isn't dramatic when you're living it. It only looks heroic in hindsight. I thought about how many people live inside stories written by someone else, doubting their own perception because the louder voice insists otherwise. I wondered how many of them were being told they were broken when they were actually just paying attention. The thought stayed with me. It still does. Slowly, opportunities I'd once dismissed began to feel possible again. I took a class. I traveled alone for the first time in years. I made decisions without rehearsing how to justify them. Each experience reinforced a simple truth. Competence returns when it's no longer under attack. Daniel faded into the background of my life, not as a villain, but as a lesson. I stopped checking for his reactions, stopped wondering what version of me he told people about now. Control only works when attention feeds it. I reclaimed mine. On the anniversary of the day I left, I did something symbolic just for myself. I took one of the notebooks, not the most damning or dramatic, but the first one, the one that started as a way to quiet my thoughts. I sat by a window and read it one final time. Then I closed it, thanked the version of me who wrote it, and placed it back in the box. Some things don't need destruction to lose their power. They just need acknowledgement. I am careful now about the stories I believe about myself and others. I listen more than I speak. I trust patterns over promises, and I no longer mistake kindness for compliance. These aren't scars, they're tools. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever been told you were too emotional, too confused, too broken to trust yourself, I hope you hear this clearly. Your awareness is not a flaw. Your quiet is not absence, and your patience may be the very thing that carries you through. I wasn't broken. I was documenting everything. And in the end, what I documented most carefully was my own return.
As more time passed, I began to notice how deeply the experience had changed the way I moved through the world. Not in obvious ways, not in anything someone could point to and say, "There, that's it." It was subtler than that. I listened differently now. When people spoke, I heard not just their words, but what they avoided, what they rushed past, what they softened with humor. I'd learned through necessity that truth often lives in the margins. I became more selective about who had access to me. This wasn't bitterness, it was discernment. I no longer felt the need to be understood by everyone, only by those willing to listen without rewriting me. That alone filtered out a surprising number of people. Some drifted away quietly, others resisted, uncomfortable with the version of me that no longer over-explained or apologized. I let them go. Peace requires room. Occasionally, someone would ask how I knew when it was time to leave. I always paused before answering because the truth was less dramatic than they expected. There was no single moment, no explosion, no final straw. There was just a slow accumulation of evidence that staying meant disappearing. Leaving meant risk, yes, but it also meant possibility. When the cost of staying outweighs the fear of leaving, clarity arrives without ceremony. I started keeping a different kind of record now, not dates and lies, but moments of alignment. Days when my body felt calm, conversations that left me energized instead of drained, decisions that felt clean. I wanted to remember what health felt like so I wouldn't mistake intensity for intimacy again. This notebook stayed on my nightstand, not hidden away. It didn't need secrecy, it needed honesty. There were still echoes, of course. Certain phrases could tighten my chest without warning. Someone speaking for me in a meeting would trigger a flash of heat behind my eyes. But now I addressed it in real time. I can speak for myself, I'd say evenly. The first time I did it, my hands shook. The second time, less so. Confidence isn't the absence of fear, it's familiarity with it. I learned that people who benefit from your silence will always call your voice disruptive. That lesson alone reshaped how I understood so many dynamics I'd previously accepted as normal. Power rarely announces itself as cruelty. It dresses as concern, as patience, as help. Knowing that changed the way I evaluated kindness, including my own. One evening, while sorting papers for taxes, I stumbled across an old financial statement from the early years of my marriage. I remembered how proud we'd been then, how transparent everything felt. I sat with that memory without trying to rewrite it. Not all of it had been a lie. That mattered to acknowledge. Complexity doesn't weaken truth, it strengthens it. People can be both caring and controlling, loving and manipulative. Holding both realities is part of healing. I stopped seeing myself solely as someone who survived something bad. That identity had its place, but it wasn't the whole picture. I was also someone who planned, adapted, and executed under pressure. Someone who trusted herself enough to wait. Someone who protected her future self even when it meant enduring misunderstanding in the present. Those qualities didn't vanish when the crisis ended. They integrated. Every so often, I receive messages from strangers who hear my story and recognize themselves in it. They ask what the first step should be. I never tell them what to do. I tell them to write things down, to observe without immediately correcting, to create a private record that belongs only to them. Clarity often emerges not from confrontation, but from accumulation. I don't know what became of Daniel beyond the fragments that reach me through mutual acquaintances. I don't ask. His life is no longer a reference point for mine. That separation feels like the final boundary, one I didn't have to enforce actively because it held itself. Distance, when earned, is self-sustaining. On quiet mornings now, sometimes I sit with a cup of coffee and do nothing at all. No planning, no monitoring, just stillness. It's in those moments I realize how far I've come. The absence of urgency used to scare me. Now it feels like a gift I worked very hard to deserve. If there's a closing truth to all of this, it's simple. Being underestimated didn't save me by accident. It saved me because I chose to use that space intentionally. I chose patience over panic, observation over reaction, documentation over denial. Those choices didn't make me weak. They made me free. I wasn't broken. I was paying attention, and attention, when sustained long enough, becomes power.
By the time I realized my story had settled into something I could carry without effort, a full year had passed since I'd left. Anniversaries are strange that way. They arrive quietly, without demanding acknowledgement, yet everything in your body seems to remember. I didn't mark the day with ceremony. I went to work, made dinner, folded laundry. Ordinary actions felt like a quiet triumph. Normalcy, chosen freely, is its own celebration. I noticed how differently I responded to stress now. Where panic once surged, curiosity followed instead. When something felt off, I didn't immediately internalize it as my failure. I examined it. That shift alone altered my relationships. I no longer rushed to smooth discomfort for others. I let pauses exist. It was surprising how often the truth surfaced in those pauses without any prompting at all. I began mentoring a younger colleague at work, a woman who reminded me of myself in small, unsettling ways. She apologized constantly. She second-guessed decisions she'd already made well. When she spoke, she watched faces for permission. I didn't tell her my story outright. I just modeled something different. I spoke clearly, I held my ground kindly, and when she apologized unnecessarily, I said, "You don't need to be sorry for that." I watched relief flicker across her face like recognition. There's a particular grief that comes with realizing how long you lived in a reduced version of yourself. It isn't regret exactly, it's mourning. I let myself feel it without rushing past. Grief, unlike fear, doesn't need to be solved. It needs to be witnessed. I gave myself that witness. Occasionally, I imagined what would have happened if Daniel had succeeded, if I hadn't documented, if I'd believed his version of me. The thought was chilling, but it no longer paralyzed me. It reminded me why stories like mine matter. Control thrives in silence. Records disrupt it. I stopped hiding the fact that I'd been through something difficult, not in a confessional way, but in a matter-of-fact one. When relevant, I named it. I left a controlling marriage. No embellishment, no justification. The words felt clean. Honest language is a form of reclamation. My sense of time changed too. I no longer rushed healing as if it were a task to complete. Some lessons arrive fully formed, others need repetition. I accepted that growth isn't linear. Strength doesn't mean never faltering. It means trusting yourself enough to recover quickly. One afternoon, I received an unexpected letter from Daniel's sister. She apologized for not seeing things sooner, for believing the version of me that required the least disruption. I appreciated her honesty. I didn't need the apology, but I accepted it. Accountability, when it arrives unforced, has its own quiet dignity. I reflected often on the word broken, how easily it's used to dismiss complexity. Broken things are thrown away, replaced, fixed without consent. That label had almost cost me everything. Now, when I hear it used casually about someone else, I pause. I ask questions. I listen for context. Compassion isn't about saving people. It's about refusing to simplify them. I continued writing, but differently now. Essays, reflections, pieces I never planned to publish. Writing had carried me through survival. Now it accompanied understanding. The page remained a place where I could be fully precise, without interruption. As my life expanded again, I became more comfortable with uncertainty. I didn't need every answer in advance. I trusted my ability to respond. That trust was hard-won. It came from living proof that I could navigate complex danger and come out intact. If I could speak to the version of myself who first picked up that notebook, I wouldn't warn her or rush her. I'd sit beside her and say, "Keep going. You're not imagining this, and you're stronger than you think." Sometimes the only validation you get is the one you give yourself. That has to be enough. My story doesn't end with triumph or bitterness. It ends with discernment, with an earned calm, with a life no longer narrated by someone else. I wasn't broken. I was documenting everything, and in doing so, I documented the quiet power of paying attention. Months turned into years, and the small rhythms of my reclaimed life became grounding pillars I didn't take for granted. I had routines now that were entirely mine. Morning walks where I counted nothing but the rhythm of my steps. Coffee sipped slowly on the balcony, watching the sunlight shift through the trees. I began to notice details I had never had time or permission to notice before. The curve of a neighbor's garden, the patterns clouds made across the sky, the sound of my own laughter unprompted. These small acts were quiet victories, subtle markers that the life I was rebuilding was authentically mine. I started attending a local writers' circle, partly because I needed a space to practice the voice I hadn't been allowed to develop for so long. At first, sharing even the tiniest pieces of my story felt dangerous. My hand shook while reading passages that hinted at manipulation, control, or betrayal. But each time I shared, I felt a little more grounded, a little more anchored in my own authority. People listened, not with judgment, but with care. I realized that had been missing for years, a space where words could exist without being twisted into someone else's narrative. Even in casual social settings, I noticed changes. Conversations that would once have left me apologizing or shrinking now left me calm and measured. If someone interrupted me, I paused, met their eyes, and continued speaking. It wasn't arrogance, it was presence. Power doesn't need to shout, it simply occupies space fully. One night, I sat down and began to reread the old notebooks, not the ones I'd set aside for evidence, but the ones I'd written during the first months of documenting. My handwriting was jagged, hurried, raw. Each page pulsed with fear and determination in equal measure. I remembered how heavy the days it felt, how isolating it was to be surrounded by disbelief. But I also remembered the strange comfort that came from the knowledge that I was preserving reality, no matter how others tried to rewrite it. Holding those notebooks now, I felt both tenderness and awe for the woman who wrote them. She had fought quietly, but she had fought fiercely. At work, I began taking on projects that required initiative and foresight. Where once I hesitated to make decisions for fear of misjudgment, I now trusted my own judgment without apology. Colleagues began noticing a new confidence, not the loud, performative kind, but the calm, steady authority that comes from understanding yourself deeply. Occasionally, I would pause and think about Daniel, and I'd feel neither rage nor sadness, but clarity. His actions had given me a lesson I wouldn't have learned any other way. Never underestimate the power of patience, observation, and recording the truth. I also noticed how important community became. The friends who had stayed close, those I had quietly checked in with during the worst of it, became lifelines. We shared meals, walks, and long conversations late into the night. I no longer feared asking for help. I had learned that independence is powerful, but reliance isn't weakness, it's connection. And connection was something I had been denied for far too long. The emotional weight of betrayal doesn't vanish, it shifts. It lingers in unexpected moments, a familiar tone of voice, a sideways glance, the smell of cologne. At first, these triggers jolted me, shaking the calm I had carefully cultivated, but I learned to breathe through them, to let them pass without giving them space to dominate. I began labeling them in my mind not as reminders of damage, but as evidence of survival. I was no longer their victim. I was the one who bore witness, who kept records, who outlasted them. One day, while walking through a bookstore, I came across a journal that caught my eye. Its cover was simple, unassuming. I bought it, not for documentation of danger, but for reflection, for recording victories, small and large, for noting moments of clarity, joy, and resilience. I began writing with a new purpose, the weight of the old notebooks behind me, the promise of this new life ahead. The difference was subtle but profound. My writing no longer tracked fear or betrayal. It celebrated presence, choice, and integrity. Daniel's memory faded over time, not because I forced it to, but because the space he once occupied had been replaced by my own attention. I no longer analyzed emails, texts, or phone calls for hidden meaning. I no longer anticipated manipulation. I existed in the present. It was a strange liberation, one that I hadn't anticipated. Freedom is quieter than people expect. It doesn't roar, it hums. Even in love, I began cautiously exploring possibilities. I didn't rush. I didn't look for validation or rescue. I simply noticed how it felt to be seen without being underestimated. I noticed trust building slowly, with careful attention to patterns rather than promises. It was an education in healthy boundaries, one that the old version of me could only have dreamed of. And when I laughed at dinner with someone new, unguarded and spontaneous, I realized I was capable of connection again. Real, undistorted connection. Sometimes late at night, I still think about how I began documenting everything, how that small act of survival became a lifeline. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving Daniel wrong to the world. It was about preserving myself, piece by piece, word by word. And in doing so, I realized that attention is more powerful than rage, patience more formidable than confrontation. I wasn't broken. I was recording the truth. And in the end, that truth became my freedom. Now, when I reflect on the past, I don't dwell on what was taken away from me. I focus on what I rebuilt: clarity, confidence, independence, and self-trust. Every notebook, every note, every detail I meticulously documented served as proof that I existed, fully and undeniably. It wasn't about vindication. It was about witnessing my own life and honoring the person I was, the person I had been, and the person I would continue to become. I wasn't broken. I was attentive, and that attentiveness shaped everything that followed. By the time I had fully settled into my own life, I realized how much the act of documenting had reshaped not just my survival, but my identity. For years, I had been convinced that silence equaled weakness, that compliance was the only way to navigate danger. But as I looked back, I understood that what had been perceived as passivity was actually strategy. Every note, every photograph, every careful recollection had been a thread connecting me to a future I couldn't yet imagine. Those threads had held me together when everything else threatened to unravel. I began to notice the subtle ways trauma had changed my thought patterns, and I worked deliberately to shift them. Where I had once doubted every choice I made, I now tested and trusted my instincts. Where I had second-guessed my memory, I now relied on it like a compass. Each decision I made was infused with self-awareness, an internal check that said, "This is mine." I had learned to distinguish between the noise of manipulation and the signal of my own intuition. That distinction became a new kind of power. Friends often commented on how measured I had become. "You're so calm now," they'd say, or "you seem to see things more clearly than before." I didn't correct them. Calmness, I realized, is not the absence of emotion, but mastery over it. Observation is not indifference, but preparation. The lessons I had learned were quiet, invisible to those who had never lived under the weight of calculated control, and that was okay. Not everyone needs to understand the survival tactics of someone who endured deception from within their own home. I took more control over my finances, not just as protection, but as empowerment. I opened accounts in my own name, invested carefully, and planned my expenses with precision. Each transaction was an affirmation of my autonomy. Each decision reinforced the simple but powerful fact that I could provide for myself, navigate my world, and reclaim the space that had been narrowed for so long. Independence isn't dramatic, it's quiet. It's built in small acts, repeated consistently, but the impact is enduring. During this period, I began mentoring women who were navigating their own complicated situations. Some had left controlling relationships, others were in the early stages of recognizing manipulation and gaslighting. I didn't give advice lightly. I didn't tell them what to do. I offered frameworks, shared my experiences, and emphasized the importance of documentation and observation. Patterns are often invisible until someone has the patience to trace them. I had learned to trace patterns before chaos had erased my own voice, and teaching others to do the same became a way to honor my journey. There were moments when I reflected on what I had almost lost, not just material possessions, though those had been important, but my sense of self. Daniel had attempted to rewrite my identity, frame me as unstable, as fragile, as someone incapable of rational thought. And yet, ironically, it was through the lens of his manipulation that I discovered my resilience. What he saw as my weakness became my greatest tool. Observation became skill, writing became strategy, patience became leverage. The quiet I had cultivated was not absence, it was accumulation. Sometimes, even now, I feel the echo of fear, a sudden sound in the night, an unexpected message, a familiar tone of voice. But these moments no longer dominate me. I label them, breathe through them, and move on. They are reminders of what I survived, not threats to what I have rebuilt. Fear is no longer a dictator in my life. It's a teacher, one I now control. As I moved forward, I also allowed myself to explore joy without guilt. Simple pleasures, sunlight on my skin, a warm cup of tea, a walk without a destination, became acts of reclamation. I noticed that life, in its ordinary textures, was richer and fuller than I had ever allowed myself to experience when Daniel's shadow hovered over me. Freedom is not always the absence of difficulty. Often it is the ability to notice beauty in small, unguarded moments. I reconnected with family members I had once distanced myself from, partly to protect my own stability during the marriage. These reunions were cautious at first. I tested boundaries. I observed reactions. I allowed myself to be present without ceding control. Relationships, I realized, are built on mutual respect and attention. Anything else is a risk to your autonomy, and I had learned to protect mine fiercely. I also allowed myself to feel the full scope of what I had endured: loss, betrayal, manipulation, all of it was part of my story. I didn't minimize it, and I didn't let it define me. Instead, I integrated it into the narrative of my life. Every entry in those early notebooks, every photo, every carefully recorded detail became part of a larger testimony that clarity and resilience can survive even the most insidious attempts to erasure. That attention, persistence, and patience can create a shield stronger than anger or confrontation ever could. When I finally revisited the place where Daniel and I had once lived, it felt surreal. The rooms were familiar, but they no longer held power over me. I walked through the space with the calm observation I had honed over years. I noted details, yes, but without attachment. The house was just a structure, memories contained within walls. I had been the one who gave meaning to those moments, and I had chosen to reclaim that meaning elsewhere. One quiet evening, I sat with my current journal and wrote not about betrayal, not about surveillance, not about strategy, but about presence, about the gentle, powerful act of noticing, about how observing one's own life carefully, attentively, and with intention can create not just safety, but freedom. I wrote about the woman I had been, the woman I had become, and the woman I was still learning to be. And I realized fully that documenting everything had not just been a survival tactic, it had been a reclamation of my selfhood. I wasn't broken. I had never been broken. I had been underestimated, misrepresented, and tested, and I had survived not because I fought loudly, but because I listened, observed, and recorded every detail with patience and care. That attentiveness became my armor, my strategy, my liberation. It allowed me to step forward into a life of choice, clarity, and quiet power. With each passing year, the rhythm of my life settled into something both steady and profound. I had a routine, yes, but it wasn't dictated by obligation or fear. It was dictated by intention. I made choices deliberately: when to speak, when to listen, when to act, when to simply observe. That discipline, learned under duress, had become second nature, and it transformed everything from my work to my friendships to my own relationship with myself. I began to see more clearly how manipulation operates in subtle ways. It doesn't always shout. It whispers, it nudges, reframes, and quietly rewrites the story of your life. What Daniel did could have dismantled me if I hadn't been paying attention, but because I had documented everything, because I had preserved my perspective and my memory, I had a defense stronger than confrontation or anger. I had the truth, and truth, when presented carefully, is its own unassailable power. In professional settings, I noticed how often people attempt to take credit or control. I applied the same principles I had used in my personal life: observation, careful record keeping, and patience. I learned to assert boundaries without aggression. I learned that authority doesn't require intimidation. It requires clarity, consistency, and evidence. The same methods that protected me from Daniel now guided me in every decision I made. The discipline of documenting transformed into a life skill, one that created opportunity and protection in equal measure. I also learned to savor the ordinary in ways I hadn't before. Breakfast with friends, walks through quiet streets, reading a book without interruptions. Every small act of normalcy felt like a reclamation of time and space that had been systematically minimized. I began to notice the subtle joy in being present, in having choices uncoerced, in being able to live without constantly questioning reality. The simplest moments became profound lessons in freedom. There were moments when anger and grief returned, not in waves but in whispers. I might see someone controlling, dismissive, or gaslighting another person and feel a flash of memory, a sting of recognition. but now I could witness it without being consumed. Observation had become power. I no longer needed to react for self-preservation. I could react for clarity, for intervention, or sometimes simply for understanding. That distinction changed the way I moved through the world. Occasionally, I received messages from people who had been through controlling relationships, people who were just beginning to recognize manipulation or gaslighting in their own lives. They asked me what to do first. I always emphasized documentation, observation, and patience. I never said confrontation was the answer. Confrontation is loud and messy. Clarity and evidence endure. The principle that saved me could save them too. I shared my story as a template for vigilance and self-trust, not for blame or revenge. I revisited some of the early notebooks from my time documenting Daniel's behavior. Reading them now, I was struck by the meticulous care I had taken, even when fear made my hands tremble. Each detail, each date, each precise recollection was a thread connecting me to survival. They were a testament to resilience and intelligence disguised as compliance. I didn't feel bitterness reading them. I felt awe. I had endured more than I knew at the time, and I had emerged intact. That realization alone was healing. Living free of Daniel's influence also gave me the space to explore who I was outside of survival. I discovered interests I had abandoned, passions I had suppressed. I traveled alone, took classes, and even learned new skills just for the joy of learning. I noticed that reclaiming life isn't about grand gestures. It's about building small, consistent habits that reaffirm your autonomy. Freedom grows quietly, measured in choices rather than drama. Over time, I realized that my identity had been fractured not by external events, but by the narratives imposed on me. Daniel's insistence that I was fragile, unstable, or incapable had been a story told over and over to anyone who would listen, and for a while I almost believed it. But in documenting everything, I had created a counter-narrative, one I could trust. I had proof of my competence, my clarity, my awareness. I had the story I needed to hold on to, and holding on to it became an act of self-preservation that ultimately transformed into empowerment. I learned that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, but only with careful attention. I learned to evaluate relationships with both intuition and evidence. I no longer gave my trust freely, but neither did I hoard it unnecessarily. Boundaries became my blueprint for interaction, not walls to isolate myself. And the people who respected those boundaries became my chosen family, my support, my community. For the first time, I realized that a life guided by attention and integrity could also be warm and connected. I also noticed how much my perspective on fear had shifted. Fear, I realized, is only dangerous when it prevents action. If you can channel it into observation, documentation, and strategy, it becomes a tool rather than a barrier. I no longer feared being underestimated. I embraced it as a protective cloak, one that allowed me to move forward deliberately without alerting those who might seek to manipulate me. My quiet became a strategy, and strategy became liberation. Looking back, I understood the deeper lesson Daniel inadvertently taught me. It wasn't about revenge or punishment or proving him wrong. It was about reclaiming my own story, protecting my mind and body, and trusting my capacity to survive and thrive. Documentation had been the key. Patience had been the tool. Observation had been the shield, and all of it together became the foundation for a life that was fully my own. Even now, when I reflect on that time, I see the value in careful attention. The act of observing, recording, and preserving truth is not just about defense, it's about life. It's about ensuring that no one else can dictate who you are or how you are remembered. I wasn't broken. I had been underestimated, but that underestimation became my advantage. And in the end, paying attention, documenting everything, and trusting myself had given me far more valuable than justice. It had given me freedom. The final chapter of that period of my life wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no grand reveals, no public shaming. The drama had already played out quietly through patience, observation, and meticulous record-keeping. What remained was a life rebuilt from fragments I had preserved, word by word, page by page. I had finally arrived at a place where my decisions were my own, my time my own, and my presence in the world fully mine. The weight of control that had once pressed against me no longer existed. I realized then that freedom isn't about the absence of fear. It's about learning how to live while fear exists, and then noticing how little power it truly holds over you. Even now, years later, I still look back and marvel at how the simple act of documenting everything saved me. What began as a response to grief and uncertainty had evolved into a blueprint for survival, a lifeline to my future self, and ultimately a tool for self-liberation. The notebooks I once feared I'd need to confront the world with became, in the end, a quiet testament to my own awareness, my patience, and my resilience. They were proof that I had never been fragile or forgetful or broken. I had been underestimated, and that misjudgment had given me time to prepare. I found a rhythm to life that was completely different from the one I had once known. Mornings were for gentle routines, coffee, journaling, walking, reading. Days were for work, learning, creating, and helping others. Evenings were for reflection, small joys, and occasional quiet laughter with friends. Each day was a careful construction of autonomy and mindfulness. Where once I had feared being overlooked, I now found strength in it. Attention, when combined with patience, is a formidable form of power. I had learned to cultivate it deliberately. I also allowed myself to explore intimacy on my own terms. It had been so long since I had felt safe enough to trust someone completely, and I approached it cautiously. There were no sudden commitments, no rushed decisions. I observed patterns, noticed consistency, and trusted actions over words. Each relationship I allowed into my life was tested by quiet scrutiny, not suspicion, and built on mutual respect. I realized how essential that attention was, not as a barrier to love, but as a safeguard against history repeating itself. It was a strange kind of luxury to feel safe yet remain vigilant, but vigilance no longer weighed me down, it empowered me. I sometimes reflect on Daniel and what he believed about me, how he thought I was fragile, dependent, and incapable, how he told anyone who would listen that I was broken, how he assumed his version of me was enough to define me, and I feel a quiet satisfaction, not the roar of revenge, but the calm, unshakable knowledge that he was wrong. Every diary entry, every record, every detail I carefully preserved had become a map, a guide, a mirror showing the woman I always was. He had underestimated me in every way possible, and that underestimation had become my advantage. In the years since, I have shared my story with a select few, usually women who find themselves doubting themselves, questioning reality, or facing subtle manipulation. I don't give them advice in the conventional sense. I teach them to observe, to document, to preserve their own truth. I teach them that clarity is a form of resistance, patience is a form of strategy, and meticulous attention can be a lifeline. People often say, "You were so brave," but I correct them gently. I wasn't brave. I was careful. I was deliberate. I paid attention, and that is what saved me. Bravery may get you headlines. Patience and precision get you freedom. Some days, when I sit quietly in my apartment, the sunlight spilling across the floor, I open the notebooks, not the ones for survival, but the one I started for reflection. I read entries about small victories, about moments of clarity, about things that brought me joy. I marvel at the layers of my own growth. How much of life is about reclaiming your space, your voice, and your story, one small step at a time? Each entry reminds me that the past does not need to define you. The weight of betrayal can be transformed into awareness, the sting of manipulation into clarity, and the fear of loss into deliberate action. I also see how much this journey has shaped the woman I am today. I am attentive, but not paranoid. I am patient, but not passive. I am cautious, but not fearful. I have learned to navigate relationships with clarity and trust my own judgment. I have learned to observe over reaction and patience over impulsivity. I have learned that freedom is not given, it is earned, one deliberate act at a time. Most importantly, I have learned that being underestimated can be a gift. Daniel believed my silence meant weakness, my grief meant instability, my compliance meant fragility. He was wrong. My attentiveness, my quiet documentation, my patience, these were not weaknesses, they were my tools, my shield, my strategy. They allowed me to reclaim my life, to rebuild my autonomy, and to cultivate a sense of power I had never known before. I wasn't broken. I was documenting everything, and in doing so, I had preserved my truth, my voice, and ultimately, my freedom. Sometimes I imagine the life I could have had if I had been believed, supported, and trusted from the beginning, but I no longer dwell on that. Instead, I focus on what I gained through the process: awareness, resilience, patience, discernment, and a deep understanding of the importance of trusting oneself. Those are the gifts of survival, the rewards of paying attention, and I carry them with me in every decision, every relationship, and every quiet moment of reflection. Now I live fully in the present, and I look toward the future with a steady heart. I know that challenges will come, that relationships may shift, and that life will continue to test my patience and clarity. But I also know that I have survived far more subtle and insidious tests than those. I have learned to document, to observe, to wait until the right time to act. I have learned that my strength does not need validation, and my vigilance is my shield. I wasn't broken. I was always capable. I was always whole, and I am finally free to live entirely on my own terms. Looking back now, I realize the profound truth that runs through every page of my notebooks, every quiet observation, every act of patience. Survival is not about confrontation, revenge, or loud resistance. It is about listening carefully, recording truthfully, trusting yourself, and choosing the right moment to act. It is about building a life that no one can rewrite, no one can control, and no one can diminish. That life is mine. I am no longer underestimated. I am seen. I am attentive. I am free. And in that freedom, I have discovered the woman I was always meant to be.